These days, football cards or soccer cards are widespread. There's a strong secondary market for these cards, and it seems to be growing. Of course, some of these prices are ridiculously inflated and are for products that are sloppy at best. But it is clear that there's a robust collector's market out there. And the thing is, if you know anything about the history of this hobby, it really should be surprising to you. The thing is that football cards or soccer cards is nothing like the industry for something like hockey cards or basketball cards, much less anything like the famous baseball card industry. It's not really until 1993 that the football card industry was actually born. As part of the build-up to the 1994 World Cup, Upper Deck entered the small international football card market and really made its mark. Upper Deck offered products in multiple languages designed for multiple markets. And of course, Upper Deck couldn't help but include Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, and other United States stars from other sports. And in hindsight, some of these cards are pretty ironic. But the real interesting thing here is that Upper Deck wasn't exactly the first company to test this market out. It was just simply the biggest and the most capable company to give it a try. Actually, football cards have a lot in common with baseball cards, even if the secondary market for football cards has never quite taken off the way that it has for baseball. The oldest baseball cards were illustrated pieces of cardboard packaged together with cigarettes. They were supposed to help the cigarettes keep their shape in old packages like this one from 1886. In fact, the most famous cigarette card set of all time, the so-called T206 set, was just like those sets from the 1880s. Generally, the front of the cardboard had a player's picture on it and the back had an advertisement. And so the card not only served a practical purpose in the package, but it also served as a strong advertisement for the product. And kids loved collecting the cards even though the product was not technically designed for kids, right? I mean, cigarettes, we could talk about that in a different video, I guess. Anyway, the practice of selling heavily decorated cards along with cigarettes spread far and wide. Almost every single sport has a cigarette card era, though most people don't talk about it. The first American football cards from 1894 featured college player photos inserted in cigarette packages. Cricket cards came about because of this Wills's cigarette set from 1896. And similarly, we started to see football cards in sets like this 1901 Ogden cigarette set. Now, these black and white cards aren't really much to look at, and the backs are kind of generic and uninformative. But it's a cigarette card set, that's for sure. The thing is, though, that collectors of cigarette cards usually focus on cards that look really attractive, preferably in color. And it wasn't really until around 1908 that we started to see English football cards that fit the bill. This 1908 Cohen, Weenie & Company set of football captains looks a little bit more like it, at least in my opinion. The company only made 60 football cards in this set, but there were other sets included in the same cigarette packs, some of which have cards that look just absolutely fascinating. Of course, I'm not sure if there was a way to tell from the packaging what kind of card was inside. For years, football cards followed the same basic cigarette card style. In fact, cigarette cards seem to have held on for much longer in football than in other sports, and I'm not really sure why. So, for example, the Imperial Tobacco Company came out with this 1934 set of player hints for association football. It's actually a really well-designed and attractive set. But of course, the cards came in cigarette packages unless you answered the advertisement and sent in for the entire set. So compare that with a sport like ice hockey, where the final tobacco cards came out in the mid-1920s. In baseball, the Gowdy Gum Company created this famous set of cards in 1933, and the market had almost entirely switched over to selling cards together with chewing gum, not cigarettes. In fact, even this 1939 Wills's Association Footballer set was a cigarette card set. This is a date that seems kind of late for cigarette cards. It seems that only the war put an end to the tradition of football cigarette cards. And it still took until over a decade after the war for a company to finally start regularly making chewing gum cards. You see, I think this is one of the reasons why the secondary market for these cards never really took off. So in the United States, you had Topps and Bowman that were competing like mad to try to quarter the baseball card market, but in Great Britain, there was just nothing like that happening at all. If you're not aware, the Topps and Bowman baseball card rivalry of the early 1950s gave us some of the most attractive sports card sets of all time. This 1953 Bowman Color set is commonly thought of as one of the most attractive sets of all time. Topps didn't want to be outdone and came out with a gorgeous set the next year. And the backs of those 1954 Topps baseball cards are almost better than the fronts. And so Bowman responded in 1955 and so on. There were some attempts to sell football cards with bubblegum in England like this 1957 team set. but this set featured only team cards and no individual players. While it looked kind of like the American equivalent, it just wasn't the same. But it was the very next year that things changed. That's the year that a company called A&BC Chewing Gum came out with its first set, and it was those A and BC cards that really started to make headway over time. Now, I'll be blunt, the first A and BC cards don't really look like much. The backs are informative at least, but the design isn't the best in the world, and word has it that the company had a hard time collating its cards. The story is that A&BC was formed originally by 4 men, Mr. Ansons, Mr. Brown, and 2 men surnamed Coakley. They had to use an artificial sweetener due to sugar rationing at the time. A&BC was actually originally a confectionery company. In other words, they didn't just sell bubble gum, as this 1957 classified ad indicates. Anyway, at some point in the 1950s, the A&BC company decided to experiment with printing cards to go along with its chewing gum product. The earliest cards apparently represented film stars, though I don't really know much about that set. And the football cards didn't come out until 1958. Like I said, these cards are not exactly the most attractive cards in the world. But if you look ahead to 1959, you will notice that the design changed quite a bit. In fact, the design of these cards reminds me a lot of a certain Topps baseball card set. Those 1959 cards look almost exactly like the 1958 Topps baseball cards. And the thing is that this isn't a coincidence. So I've looked at a couple of secondary sources. Based on what I've read, it seems that Topps decided to strike a deal with this really small A&BC company. So under this deal, A&BC could sell Topps' Bazooka bubblegum as the gum product, and Topps would get a certain percentage of the profits in exchange. This also allowed A&BC to sell its own versions of some of Topps' non-sports cards, such as cards of Elvis Presley. Plus, as we just saw, it's pretty clear that Topps provided a lot of artistic input on card creation. Now, it actually wasn't unusual for Topps to make a deal like this. Topps had bought out what remained of its biggest competitor, Bowman, back in 1956. And around the same time as the A&BC deal, Topps entered into an agreement with O-Pee-Chee in Canada to create hockey cards. Though collectors might categorize these as Topps cards, these are actually O-Pee-Chee cards. These are cards that were printed and distributed in Canada, not the United States. And the packaging indicated that, with the O-Pee-Chee company name slightly more prominent than that of Topps. The 1959 A&BC cards didn't even mention the Topps name, though it probably didn't really matter anyway. Any experienced baseball card collector can see the connection just by glancing briefly at the card design. Anyway, that's what got the ball rolling for A&BC cards. The cards were printed throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s and were fairly popular. It's actually pretty easy to see why these cards were so popular in those days. A&BC offered full-color cards that were attractive, for the most part that is, and even the backs looked like a work of art. And some of these sets were so clearly inspired by Topps baseball card designs that it's almost funny. Now, the early 1960s really marked the high point of A&BC, but it wasn't a football card set that really put the company on the map. No, it was a rock and roll set. A&BC managed to convince the Beatles management to sign a contract for cards back in 1962. The result was an attractive series of cards that was incredibly popular right in time for Beatlemania. A&BC sub-licensed the cards to Topps, and the US versions were extremely popular back in 1964. In fact, these cards were so popular and printed in such great quantities that you can still find them today for relatively low prices. So in general, collectors of this stuff tend to get really frustrated when the price doesn't rise over time. But you have to remember that sets like this were a goldmine for companies like A&BC when they first came out, because demand was high and they could easily print enough supply to reach the demand. But those good times unfortunately didn't last forever. A&BC made high-quality sets throughout the late 1960s. In fact, I would argue that this 1972 set is the best-looking football card set of all time. The card fronts have this dramatic, almost epic quality to them, and the backs are neat and legible, though they were still doing that stupid coin rub thing. But it's around this time that A&BC had a falling out with Topps. And I don't know what happened, to be frank with you. The histories that I've read don't give any specific details at all. And of course, nobody was printing anything about the trading card industry back in those days, at least not in the mainstream press. So A&BC basically disappeared only a few years after it had reached its height. You can tell that something was off with this 1973 set, which just looks bad. The color design is an eyesore and the photos are really blurry. The 1974 set looks a little bit better, but sadly would be A&BC's last set. As soon as it had begun, the ride was over and the industry took a really big hit. Now, there were other sets in those days, but there were not a lot of what we would consider like major releases or companies that were making cards year after year. So aside from Panini's famous stickers and World Cup sets every 4 years, manufacturers generally ignored the football card market. In fact, most of the listings that I've seen have been for NASL sets, like regional sets, and even then the quality is really, really bad. So for example, back in 1975, you could get New York Cosmos cards at Jack in the Box, but these look really bad. I'm not sure which company produced this 1978 New England T-Men set, but they didn't do a good job. Meanwhile, there were a few football cards produced with these Barrett candy sticks in the 1970s and 80s. These were attractive cards in the old cigarette style, though the sets were really small. It looks like those cards were produced up until 1989 when they suddenly disappeared. And it is a shame, though it would have been really nice to have, more than 48 cards in a set. Honestly, the football card collecting industry has generally been overlooked as the decades have gone by. Again, most of the sets that you'll see when you look back through history were created to coincide with whatever World Cup was being played. Now, the special thing about A&BC is that nobody else really tried to do what they did, and when they left, nobody really came around to fill in their place. Well, not until Upper Deck in the 1994 World Cup, of course. And it's really not a surprise that Upper Deck would wind up revolutionizing the football card industry. After all, the company had done the exact same thing for baseball cards back in 1989. But there still is something special about the old A&BC sets. The funny thing is that you can still find tons of these cards for relatively cheap. I'm not sure if they're going to eventually rise in price. They certainly haven't for the last 55 years. But you have to admit that these cards are really attractive. Anyway, so I don't know, maybe the old A&BC cards are like the new market efficiency when it comes to sports card collecting, or maybe not. Now, what I would really like to see happen, though, is for somebody to challenge this current Fanatics monopoly and try to make cards in that old A&BC style. So maybe we'll get lucky and see that one of these days, but what do you think?